Hello and welcome back to the conversation here, Breaking the Consensus at Protect Life. I'd like to welcome you all this evening. Before we start, I'd just like to bring your attention to a couple of things here. There's the subscribe button there you'll see on your device. If you click on that, that means that any new material, any new videos, any new work that we have done, you'll be automatically advised of that. Also, we have, even in the midst of the pandemic, there are a lot of things going on. There are some really serious campaigns that we're engaged in, and we need your help. So there's the donate button is there. Anything you can give, we can promise you will be used effectively in a campaign to defend your values and the values of life in Ireland. So tonight, I'm delighted to be in conversation with Samuel Baker. Samuel Baker is the founder of Catholic Men, or CMUK. So Samuel, before we start, we'll just get a little bit of, well, as we start, as it were, get a little bit of bio about Samuel Baker, who he is, where he came from, how he got where he is today, and what you're doing at the moment. So I'll let you kick off.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me along for the ride. It's a great privilege to be here. So a little bit of background, and I'm sitting here in lockdown in Bedford, in the centre of England, pretty much geographically anyway. Bedford's a pretty parochial county town, so not centrally in terms of its prominence at all. I grew up in Bedfordshire. Luton, as you'll know from the airport, was my hometown, and in fact there's a great Catholic Irish community in Luton, and for a large part of my life I really thought that Catholicism was synonymous with being Irish. My parish priest was Irish, all the families that went to church were Irish, and all the lads at school, you know, Billy Toohey, Sean O'Toole, all the lads were Irish, and I used to drink at the local Irish pub and knew the lads from there. And I've always felt that Irish Catholicism had a real impact on my own sense of Catholicism growing up. You know, the people that I knew were very pious, very holy, very worthy Catholics, and I feel that I have a great debt to my Irish neighbours and parishioners, because really, you know, I felt, although I struggled growing up as a Catholic, I've never struggled with the faith. I've never had a time where I denied the faith or packed it in. Whatever problems I went through, and as you'll probably have heard in my testimony that I think you watched the video, I grew up in quite an odd cult, Catholic cult it was. In fact, a lot of the people in the cult were ex-Protestants, converted to Catholicism, and brought with them a very kind of puritanical and apocalyptic end of days Jansenist approach to the faith. But still, in amongst all of that, I met some good people, some good Catholics, who really helped me uphold the faith. But one of the problems with this particular cult was that, contrary to a number of other cults, it was a very matriarchal cult. The priest who set it up, himself also a convert to Catholicism, he really was the alpha male, and he pushed the men away. In fact, he even got them to leave their wives, leave their families, and rent other accommodation to have a sort of period of, well, I don't know, some kind of odd retreat where they had to sort of find themselves. I can't remember what it was, but it was all very bizarre. But what he in effect did was to elevate the women to his sort of handmaidens. And although there was nothing physically weird about the whole thing, you know, spiritually, emotionally, mentally, it was very odd. And when he died, it was the women who took over the cult and led it. And I suppose in contrast to male-led cults where one would anticipate a lot of physical abuse, perhaps some sexual abuse, and often the men, don't they, in these cults end up either shooting everyone or shooting themselves, if you see the Americans, the way the Americans do it. So in contrast to all of this, this was very much emotional and mental abuse that went on. That the sort of the grasp for power was real emotional manipulation. And what I remember from it was an awful lot of chat and debate and discussion and conversation, as one would expect perhaps from women, and it never went anywhere. But there's a lot of soul searching and real trying to sort of, you know, churn everything up. Really what was happening was that the woman who was mainly in charge of it was just keeping her own form of control over what was going on. The upshot of that was that as a young lad, I had no real sense of what it meant to be a man. The men had been emasculated, my poor father among them. And eventually he left. He actually took a very courageous decision and left the cult. And as we know, if you leave a cult, you're a pariah, you're cast out. But then there was for me no model of masculinity to follow. And I felt really adrift as a man. I was a very, let's say, I was on the sort of weak, bland end of masculinity. I used to suck my thumb a lot and sort of sit in a corner with a book, and you know, thumb sucking moved on to masturbation as a sort of comfort and the filling the void. And masturbation moved on to pornography when I got the chance to. And it took me a long time to lift myself out of this emasculation and to understand what real masculinity meant. And I found that, as I said in my testimony, in the Catholic Church, in reading Catholic teaching, in reading the Fathers, in reading Aquinas and so on and so forth. And you know, just to wrap up the story, you asked for a short bio. This one wasn't short. I looked for other men who I could sort of work alongside and imitate and learn from. And so I set up a parish men's group. And from that became eventually Catholic Man UK, which is now in fact Catholic Man UK and Ireland, because we do have a large number of Irish members, and several of them asked if we could change the name to encompass that, which we did. And so there we are.
I'm curious, when we hear the word cult, it's a powerful word. I mean, it brings a lot of baggage with it. What was the relationship of the cult to the, shall we say, the official church?
On the surface, they pretty much, I think this might have been its saving grace, they pretty much adhered to the teachings of the church. And I think, although I wasn't given any peculiar understanding of the church's teaching, I think I was just given some very shrouded or veiled understanding, and that in itself was a way of holding on to power. You know, don't tell them everything that they need to know, and let's just keep them in the dark here. It was more the way that it was put across. We were told that we had a level of knowledge about the end of days that perhaps might have been, you know, on the level of, say, the seers in Medjugorje. You know, this was something divinely given to us through this particular priest. And that made us as children actually very scared. My siblings tell me how scared they were as children of the end of days. And in fact, as the year 2000 approached, I could sense that the whole community was getting edgy. But yeah, my younger sisters would tell me the absolute petrification that they had about the end of days. And not all my siblings now, there's 6 of us, and there were 3 or 4 other families involved, some couples, some single people. But you know, not all of them have actually remained in the church. Some of them just went, you know what, this is a load of crap, I'm out.
But there was a kind of a millenarian element feeling a little bit to it. I'm just curious. It's not you no reason why you would have an answer to this, but I've never really understood why the end of the world should make a difference to a Catholic.
Well, quite.
You know,
yeah.
In a sense that every human being faces the end of the world every minute of the day, and so the world is ending tomorrow. Well, if that information changes your life, well, then something's wrong with your life anyway. I mean, what's the importance of the end of the world?
Again, I think it was an element of coercion. You know, we were, because we were put under this level of fear, it meant that we could be manipulated in doing certain things or not doing certain things. You know, the sense that not so much that the world was going to end, but it was going to end pretty damn soon. And if you don't get your act together, you're going to be in trouble. So you better get your act together. And here's how I'm going to tell you how to do it or not do it. So one of the very odd things was that, yeah, I specifically was deemed to be a bad child, a bad person. And I was denied access to the sacraments for many years until I'd got myself in a position of being worthy enough to access the sacraments. Now that's a very powerful hold to have over a child. And I had no idea what I'd done wrong.
Right, I mean, that, you're talking about the church, that couldn't be licit, could it?
Oh no, not at all. No, and in fact, I think that the bishop or the bishops around the time did send people to this community to say, you sent priests to them to say, look, this shouldn't happen. And the priest himself, which set up the community, was moved to far-flung parishes and told not to have any involvement. But he did under the radar. He always did. He would pop up on his day off during the week, put the cat among the pigeons, and then head off again for the week back to his parish, while the rest of us just sat there crapping ourselves about what we should or shouldn't be doing. So it was a very chaotic spiritual environment in which I grew up in. And for me, what was then very key, and I think quite key to this sense of masculinity, was the need to look for absolutes. In a paradoxical way, you'd have thought I wanted to run as far away from absolutes because that was what the cult was sort of hammering home. But no, I needed to find out what it was to be really human, really masculine, and really Catholic. So in a way, and I don't begrudge what happened, because it set me on a particular path, a particular voyage of discovery, if you want to put it that way, as to what it really meant to be me, to be human. And that meant to be a man. And that also meant to be a Catholic man.
It's interesting, you use the word chaos there. And of course, in all of the symbolic language of all the great wisdom traditions of the religions of the world, the opposite of chaos or order is associated with masculinity. Chaos isn't necessarily a bad thing, but rather we live in this tension between order and chaos. We need some chaos, we need some order, but that particularly for children, chaos is really problematic. Children, they seek security, reassurance, routine, predictability. And it's only as we evolve maybe and become more, when we're rooted and secure, then we can go into the chaos more securely. But I don't think therefore it's maybe surprising that from a chaos that what you sought out was this. So well, let's talk. The central thing that you're interested in is fatherhood, what it is to be a man and what it is to be a father, I suppose, consequently. So what were the first insights that you started to accrete? What are the first things that you started to become interested in that resonated with you?
One of the big things that I remember throughout my adolescence and throughout my 20s was that I had a real attraction to dominant alpha masculinity, not in any sexual sense at all, but in a sort of fascination that there was something out there, something so different to me that I really longed for. Growing up in the 80s, I loved Rambo and Terminator and Rocky and all that, Bruce Willis, all those sort of really physical action heroes, and I was really bemused about myself that I knew in situations where I was perhaps idolizing these types of men. If I found myself in a particular situation, let's say, I don't know, with a bunch of rugby players or something like that, I knew I was out of my depth. Mm-hmm. I knew I wasn't on the same level as them. They had an easy familiarity with each other. They had the banter, they had the jostling, and yet at the right time, they seemed to be able to sort of switch into serious mode, or they seemed to be able to just know what they needed to do. And I thought that, they've got, they've got the same genitalia as me. Why am I so different to them? And I think I spent a lot of time just observing and watching. and imitating, and retrospectively, that's what I should have been doing as a boy rather than as a teenager and in my early 20s. And bit by bit, starting to sort of piece together and try out for myself what it meant to be this kind of man. It didn't really take, though, until I actually married. And on the back of this, I'm actually surprised someone wanted me enough to marry me, because still in my late 20s, I was still kind of weak and insipid and just not really knowing what to do with myself. Anyway, luckily, I did get married to a lovely lady, and had kids, and at the same time renewed my own relationship with my father. And I said to him at the time, I think sort of my kids were quite young, but I remember recalling that his decision to leave the cult was actually a very brave and wise decision, and he did it for the sake of his family, for the sake of his kids. We moved out, and eventually my mother moved out and joined my father, but she was technically still tied to the community, and they had an awful marriage for 15, 20 years, something like that, as we were growing up. And so as a father myself, at one point I was talking to my dad, and I said, I need to say to you, Dad, that what you did was the most courageous thing that I ever remember from this whole dreadful setup. And his jaw dropped and hit the ground, and he was almost sort of overcome, because he had no idea that we, us children, viewed him through that kind of lens and viewed what he did through that lens. So he was, it opened the floodgates for him. He thought he was still a pariah. He thought he'd still done the wrong thing, that he was going to go to hell. He was damned because he wasn't following what the cult said. And this opened up, goodness knows, years and years then of conversation between myself and my father as we tried to repair our relationship with each other, and our own sense of self together. It was rather odd, because I was almost a step ahead of him, and so things I had seen and understood about masculinity I was sharing with my own father. Now my father himself suffered poor fathering from an alcoholic and drug dependent father, who died when my dad was young. My dad was in his 20s. So it was as if my dad and I together were discovering what it meant to be men, what it meant to be husbands, what it meant to be fathers, and we talked an awful lot together. It was a very, very blessed time. In fact, we went to see a couple of I say ex-cult members. They sort of left the community in the very early days. And my dad was quite good friends with one of these men. We went back to see him, and he hadn't had anything to do with the community for years and years. And that kind of helped repair some of these issues. And I think this is really important with men who suffer from this particular father wound, as it were, in whatever circumstance. This retracing one's steps back to those foundational elements that affected or impacted one's sense of self and masculinity.
Sorry,
go on.
You've used, in reference to yourself, a number of times, you've used the word weak. What do you mean by that? What do you mean by weakness? So
part of the journey was discovering the virtues, and Aristotle and Aquinas, and let's take Aristotle's view on the virtues. He sees the virtue as the median between two opposing vices, a vice on the excessive end and a vice on the sort of weak, mediocre end. So if you take the virtue of courage, for example, that's the median between recklessness on the excessive end and between cowardice on the mediocre end. And one's life as a man of virtue, as a man sort of trying to acquire virtue, is to take oneself away from those excessive ends, those sort of vices, and center oneself on the virtue. So in terms of weakness, I was on that weak end of the vices. I was the sort of the faint-hearted young man. I was the well, I mean, if you take the cardinal virtues, you know, I wasn't temperate, I wasn't prudent, I wasn't courageous, and I've forgotten the other one, whatever the fourth one is.
Justice.
That's right. Yes. You know, if justice is giving everyone their due, I was very self-centered. I was all about me and what my needs were. Now, Aquinas calls this sort of weak end of the spectrum a softness, a mollity, he calls it. And there was a real softness about myself. As I said, I was a thumb sucker. I'd sit in a corner with a book, sucking my thumb, and you know, I didn't really exercise, for example. The first time I sort of hit the rugby field, I was absolutely pulverized. I suppose the saving grace is, and I think every man needs to understand this, whatever end of the spectrum they are, is that you can move along the spectrum. Now, this is a movement that should happen in childhood, in boyhood, and I'm very aware of my own two sons, that, you know, I need to scaffold their lives for them, provide them with opportunities to grow into men, opportunities that I didn't have, and had to reinvent the masculine wheel for myself to move away from that softness, to toughen myself up. And a lot of that is through self-discipline. You know, self-discipline is sort of almost embracing the pain on a daily basis to change and to grow.
Sorry.
But the joy of it is that it works. You can change. You can move from that position of soft boyishness into a toughened adult, mature male.
Just to tease something out there, because I think it's interesting. You talk the Aristotelian opposition of the two extremes. Say if we take courage, on one hand it's cowardice, but on the other hand, that means also that recklessness can also be a form of weakness. So just because you see the guy that will drive his motorcycle at 150 miles an hour, people might look at that and see that as being an example of masculinity, of strength. But or the guy that jumps over the cliff, or the guy who takes, maybe he's reckless with drugs or whatever, but things that we might say, oh, that's masculinity, that's strength. But in that analysis, that in itself is also a form of weakness, because it's
absolutely.
control.
And I think this is where fatherhood comes into play, because what I then realized was that these weaknesses, whichever end of the spectrum they're on, they are weaknesses because they are self-centered, entirely self-centered. Fatherhood takes one out of oneself to give to another. In fact, not just to give, but to sacrifice and give up, give everything to another. And I said earlier that I needed to look for absolutes. And one of the things that I did was to, and I don't quite know how I discovered this, possibly through Scott Hahn maybe, but going back to Genesis and really realizing that the sort of archetypal roles of masculinity, and these come up in Jungian psychology, for example, of male leadership and of protection and provision, that one can find these written into Genesis. In fact, not only written into Genesis, but written into masculinity. And so I was able to come up with 4 key, I say come up with, of course I didn't, they're archetypal, they're there anyway, but I was able to discover these sort of 4 key roles of masculinity, which in fact start with procreation. You know, where God said, you be fruitful and multiply. But in order for procreation to be successful, the man needs first to take a role of primacy, a leadership role, because if you think about the marriage proposal, it's the man who proposes to the woman and says, look, it's not just a marriage, it's not symbolic of asking the hand in marriage, it's a suggestion. I'm proposing to you that we start a family, that we join in God's creative abilities and create a family between us. And so it's the man that kind of stimulates the move towards life, towards procreation. So that's only 2 elements, though. In order to be able to make that successful, the man has to be able to protect that life that he's going to generate, and the woman who's going to look after that life and provide for them. Now, this is all in Genesis. You know, God gives man dominion over creatures. And in fact, and we might come back to this later, it is after the fall, actually, that God then says to the woman that the man will rule over her. In fact, prior to that, he gives dominion over creation to the man and the woman. And maybe we'll come back to the father's leadership role in a little bit more detail. And then he says to the man that the man must till the ground and keep it. Keep meaning guard. And the Hebrew, I don't speak Hebrew, but I just picked this up. The Hebrew is shamar, which is to guard. And in fact, it's the same word that is given to the angel who's placed outside the Garden of Eden after Adam's been kicked out, the word shamar. So it's a strong word. Yes, it means to really protect against evil. So I was able to, for myself, codify these 4 pillars of manhood and masculinity. Now, just to finish that little bit, so all of these is geared towards sacrificial love for the child, for the children, for the life that's been created, and for the wife who's brought that life into being. If you invert those 4 things towards oneself and make them selfish, make them toxic, as it were, then procreation becomes simply sex for recreation. It becomes masturbatory. There is no life generated within it. Then primacy really then becomes dominion over the woman, over the family. It becomes domestic abuse, if you want to, put it in that way. Provision becomes materialism. You're not providing for others, you're simply providing for yourself. It's greed, it's wealth, it's gain, it's whatever I can gain for myself. And protection perhaps is then an abuse of strength, or simply setting oneself up in isolation, protecting oneself from the others that might disturb one's cozy life. And that, I believe, is what the world sees as toxic masculinity. It is masculine, but it's masculinity turned inwards on the self. If men today were to turn all of that outwards to the other, they would discover these 4 divinely ordained pillars of fatherhood. And that's what the world is sorely missing today. Real, authentic fatherhood turned outward in sacrificial love.
I can imagine that in the wider population, a lot of people would associate this, what you're talking, your organization, and lump it in with, shall we say, other men's rights groups and things, and will say essentially what this is it's a kind of a harking back to a good old days when men were in charge, women were subservient, where as Paul says in Ephesians 5:23, the husband is the head of the wife as Christ is the head of the church, and that is taken as a relationship of dominion, of mastery. Inevitably, when you're talking fatherhood is implicit in fatherhood is motherhood and partnership. So what is the relationship of the man in this Catholic anthropology, your understanding, with in this relationship? How does that work out? What is the relationship between man and wife?
Yeah, it is one that could come under attack from all sorts of angles, but I think one also needs to look at it from all sorts of angles to try to understand it. And it was a revelation to me reading Scott Hahn, who focuses on the element of how was it that Christ loved the church? What was it that Christ did to demonstrate his love? And Christ died in absolute agony for his church. And the church and Christ's kingdom always inverts everything that we feel is right as humans. It's turned upside down, to the extent that that God was born in a manger, in a stable, in utter poverty. That that was a curveball. That came out from nowhere. And so I think we fixate on this very human understanding or notion of leadership, that it means having power and authority over someone, to the extent that you can tell them what to do and they have to do it. But if husbands were to ask themselves, what does it mean to lay down my life for my wife? I think that they would find many, many areas where they would really have to give up many aspects of their own lives that they love. And that could be going out drinking with the lads, that could be watching their game on the box, that could be going out fishing for a weekend, that could be, well, let's take it up a notch, that could be porn, that could be masturbation, that could be affairs, whatever it is. That giving up all of those things for the sake of the wife and the children and the family, and more putting the needs of the wife first, more and more putting in love, in great love, the desire of the wife first, is the first step. Now, again, you could come under a bit of attack and say, well, okay, well, you know, what if my wife just loves to go out clubbing? Does that mean I've got to stay at home with the kids? Is that putting her needs first? Is that kind of subsuming my own needs? And I'm then just a henpecked husband, you know, I'm a doormat. It's understanding, and I think this is the key actually, where men do have to take charge. It is through the teaching and passing on of the faith. That is what has been given to men divinely. We are there to pass on the faith. Now, if we are doing that to our families, and that includes our wives, passing on this understanding of the faith, one would hope, with great prayer and great grace from God, that our wives begin too to recognize and understand this way that the faith inverts everything that we know and understand in our human nature, and that our wives then work with us to bring the children up in godly families, living out the faith truly, and that she understands our sacrificial love, that she understands that the world might see this differently from the outside. I think one of the problems about this is that the discussion is had from outside looking in. My recommendation is always that you can come so unstuck in this sort of conversation that it is actually pretty much a sacred conversation that a husband and wife have together. They are living out the sacrament of marriage together. They need to find their way through it, work their way through it, ask the questions. Why does this look odd from the outside in? What does it mean for us to both live out sacrificially in love for one another? Otherwise, you do hit up against all this sort of outside accusation. So I don't know if I've answered that particularly well. But as I said, I think it has to be a conversation had within the sacrament of marriage between the husband and wife, and worked out together, you know, in mutual love.
I suppose what Scott Hahn's central theme is covenant, and the covenant between God and the chosen people, then the new covenant, but and then also covenant as marriage, and this symbolism which runs through the Old Testament of marriage, and therefore that if the Christian marriage or Catholic marriage has to be understood as a covenant relationship. And I suppose that you can't understand that demands that you accept certain things out for it to be internally coherent. It doesn't probably make sense unless you believe that there is grace. Because without grace, well, all these things become problematic.
Yeah. I think Scott Hahn says, doesn't he, that if a man says to his wife, you know, my love is such that I will lay down my life for you. I will give up everything for you. My life is yours. what woman should refuse to submit to that request? That I want to lay down my life for you, and I think in the context of a loving marriage and a particular Catholic understanding of marriage, one would hope that the spouses see the sense in that. Not only that, just one last thing I think, and this is something that's only recently sort of, perhaps as my job in Walsingham, the Shrine to Our Lady over in England, sort of grows, is how elevated Our Lady is as a woman, how much Christ has elevated his mother and has elevated womanhood. The statue of Our Lady at Walsingham, she sits on a throne, she's an empress, she's crowned. And who knows what is going to happen in the afterlife. Men may seem to have been given the upper hand in this life, but in heaven, who sits on the throne closest to our Lord? It's a woman. Who knows what God has in store for the afterlife?
The issue of the father figure, and you mentioned the father wound, is something which is become increasingly massive discussed and debated today. Jordan Peterson is one of these meteoric figures who appeared a few years ago, and this is one of the central themes. One of his themes, anyway, is that the proper roles, the idea of a given nature. But in fact, it's all of the 20th century, even from the end of the 19th to today, this issue of the father, the crisis in Europe, in the West, with the father figure. This was an obsession with Freud. Freud believed that and people like Lacan, that their purpose was to restore the father to the West. That the father. Now you talked about. It's interesting. We had Father Pat Collins on recently in our last discussion. Yeah, he was talking about this issue of the father wound. How in a world where increasing numbers of young men, also young women, because we know now, we assumed it was just young men, but it's also young women, are being impacted negatively, and that there's no discussion about this. Growing up without a father is bad for kids, but increasingly this is the reality. What can we do? Can anything be done to remediate that? For those boys, those children who are growing up with no father in their home, in their life. Educational outcomes, crime, drugs, stability in relationships, capacity to create enduring relationships, all sorts of negative outcomes can be associated with this. But so what can we do? Is there any insight or anything you've thought that we can bring to this that can help those kids?
It's a difficult one, isn't it? I think on the ground there are plenty of, and I know over in England certainly, plenty of secular organisations who are working with young men, young kids. I was in teaching for 17 years, and we set up a mentorship program with local businesses, and we get local businessmen in to help mentor the young men in school, those who are perhaps absconding from school, those who are having behaviour issues, and so on. And so there are lots of ways that it can be done. But as I said, my own discovery of the teaching of the Church Fathers, the teaching of the Catholic Church, what I found in Scripture leads us to what it really means to be men. One of the reasons I set up Catholic Man UK was I feel that it has to start at home, as it were, with fellow Catholics. There's a lot of work to do to encourage fellow Catholic men in their understanding of what it means to be a man, and turning them towards the virtues, towards Scripture, towards the Catechism of the Catholic Church. One then hopes that it will have a knock-on effect, that those men will themselves go back to their families and reorder their own families first and foremost, but then go further out, go into their parishes and mentor the kids in the parishes, set up men's groups where younger men can come and join and find father figures. there is a lot of work to do and a lot of work that can be done. And I think one of the things that I would like to be able to put out there, and I know this is happening in Ireland as it is in England and Scotland and Wales, is that men's groups, Catholic men's groups, are starting up. There are secular men's groups starting up as well. But I think that really has to be the push among Catholic men, not only for ourselves. I think first and foremost, we will find it is for ourselves. We need to be with other men. But then as we grow in confidence and grow in fraternity, we will see the need to reach out to other men in other ways. That could be through mentoring. Quite a few guys actually in Catholic Men UK and Ireland do mentor some younger chaps coming up through the ranks, as it were. And we do have a mentoring program. So that's key, certainly.
If you were speaking to somebody from outside your cultural context, are there areas, or are there, shall we say, what you would consider to be positive masculine attributes, which are misunderstood, specifically, generally, that things that people will assume that you wouldn't regard as being masculine, but that in fact you value? Or things that people assume that you would say are good, that in fact you say, well, actually, no, we don't consider that's masculine. Are there things that, well, I'm struggling here, but that there are things that you feel that are constantly misunderstood by the outside culture about your understanding of what it is to be a man?
I think one of the big things is this push for men to be in touch with their emotions, and that I think feminism largely sees that toxic masculinity is simply a problem of men not being in touch with their emotions. That if we somehow knew how to speak about our anger, or if we somehow knew how to speak about our anxiety and our stress, then the problems would be solved and men would be fine. It's simply because we've got so much pent up anger, stress, sexuality, or whatever, that it then bursts out in aggression and rape and whatever it might be. And I would say, no, not really. There has to be a certain amount of stoicism about men. That's what we do. We are able to compartmentalize. We are able to put emotions to one side and get on with the job that needs doing. That's simply how we're made. And to try and continuously emote about how we're feeling and how awful things are, and we want to get this off our chest, that's not what we do. In fact, what we do as men is that we go out fishing with other men, or we go out hill walking with other men, and we talk about the football or the rugby or whatever it might be. And in that, once we've built up a good relationship with other men, we may well open up. We may well ask about things to do with relationships. We may well let off steam about our marriages. It's done in privacy. It's done with a sense of you just keeping a veil over it between two men, between two guys. There's gentleman's honourable agreement going on there. And I think that perhaps for me is one of the biggest misunderstandings at the moment about how men should be men and behave as men.
But maybe does that not go back, I suppose, the 60s and 70s in, say, feminist theory in particular, and wider social theory, which believed that the solution to all of our problems would be androgyny, ultimately. That men would become more like women and women will become more like men, and ultimately, because all differences are social constructions. We strip away the social constructions, we just have human beings which are indeterminate and interchangeable. And therefore, once we got to that stage, you're talking about the emoting and sharing and feeling, things that would be classically associated with women. That if men did that, then they'd be fine. So the answer would be androgyny. But you're saying that actually that men have a given nature, and that nature is in some sense different to the nature of a woman.
Absolutely, yes, yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think this is perhaps the sort of the elephant in the room, or the emperor's new clothes, however we want to put it, that we somehow dance around this issue and never really get to grips with it. And in fact, if men do start to talk along these lines, I don't know if you read the story about the teacher at Eton who created the video on masculinity. And it's interesting watching commentary on it. So people, if it's brought up in an article and you read the comments underneath, it's interesting how many people will say, I can sort of see where he's going with this. I perhaps don't I don't agree with the polarization. I don't agree with his old-fashioned views. And so there's still this kind of conversation that what he tried quite radically to do was to say, this is how men are, and this is in their nature, and there's no getting away from it. And then people get very hot under the collar and say, well, surely that's wrong. Of course that's wrong. You know, and then you get into the whole thing about gender just being a construct. I think this is a kind of it's a way simply for the devil to move our view away from what is really happening here. That the popes latterly, John Paul II and Benedict XVI, really saw the destruction of fatherhood as a destruction of any view on God the Father. That God has created men to be his icons to the world, to be, as someone once said, the hands of the Father that his children cannot feel, the face of the Father that his children cannot see, the heart of the Father that his children, you know, need to learn to love. And that's our peculiar task as men. We can't get away from it. God has given that as a divinely ordained task, to be his representatives to his people on earth in human form. And so trying to eradicate fatherhood in human men is a way to eradicate the face of God the Father. And that's what we're battling against all the time. And so people who are coming back saying there's no gender, we're all androgynous, they are simply falling foul of the devil's tricks. No one's going to want to hear this. No one outside the sort of Orthodox Catholic faith, or even some Orthodox Christians do believe the same thing, but no one outside of that is really going to want to hear this. A guy called Paul Vitz wrote a book called Faith of the Fatherless.
Yes.
Saying that those prominent atheists quite often lacked good fathering, lacked a father. It's through the father that the faith is passed on. And going back to what is the task of the man in terms of leadership, it is to lead God's people in faith, simply through who we are. I mean, St. John Paul II talks about in his theology of the body that the body conveys visibly the invisible. And so if you make the man androgynous, the man can no longer convey the invisible, can no longer convey God. You no longer see God the Father through the physicality of the man. And that is today's problem. That is the problem that underpins probably pretty much every social ill that we see around us. All these drug dependent lads, all these lads joining gangs, all these social ills, abortion, contraception, all comes down to the fact that the man has lost sight of his task to convey through who he is physically, who God the Father is.
Well, I'm aware of the time, so I want. Can we just finish up on just your feelings about this? You say that nobody will be interested outside of a certain very small group of Orthodox Catholics or Christians, and yet, do you not feel that actually, I don't know if it's a tipping point or a turning moment, but there is a change. I referred to Jordan Peterson earlier. Like him, maybe people who are involved who are not necessarily sympathetic to religion at all, but work in, say, evolutionary biology and evolutionary and sociology, are becoming much more public in their statements that there is such a thing as gender difference. While men and women are much more similar to each other than they are different, that there are difference in principally not of capacity or ability. Women, I remember talking to psychologists who said that something interesting, which you reflected on earlier, that women are just as aggressive as men, but their aggression manifests itself in a different way. It's in reputational destruction. It's based on communication. It's very often a verbal or a more psychological approach. As men will hit you.
Mm.
I know most men, given the choice, would prefer to be hit.
Mm.
I remember when I was a kid in school and we were given the choice between, 5 on the hand or detention or 500 lines. Oh, please beat me.
Yeah.
When they abolished corporal punishment in Ireland,
Mm.
I remember as a class, we were all disgusted. We thought, oh no, now we're
It's lines for us now.
It was terrible. But there has been a change in people saying, you know what, if you look at societies, the more equitable those societies are, the more clearly we see the differences in temperament being expressed in the choices that people made. So I suppose I'm saying it's maybe this is your moment. Maybe this is a good moment for you to be a visible witness, to say, actually, you know what, we knew this all the time. And that ultimately in the world, the truth is successful because the truth works.
That's right. But I do think that there is going to be a great polarization between those who do recognize the truth, as you say, because it works, and those who see the truth and for whatever reason hate it and flee in the opposite direction. Because one of the things that I'm learning only latterly really is that to really accept everything that I've sort of found out in the last number of years has to also be to really accept that there is a creator and that I'm a creature and that I've been created to do something that I actually have very little hand in a way. I've either got to accept how I've been created and get on with it, or work against my created nature, and be willing to take the consequences, or at least to hide from the consequences in whatever type of drug I want to use to hide myself in. And so I think people do have a choice, that those people, even who say in the secular world, no, we are men and women, they recognize that through some gut feeling. Most of us actually recognize it simply through straightforward biology. But you know what I mean? That people out in the secular world who can sensibly see how things are will go, no, there are men and there are women. But they're going to need to come to a point of saying, and it has been divinely ordained as such. It's not just a quirk of nature. It's not just evolutionary. Because if they remain at that point, then there's nothing really for them to argue against. Because someone could come back and go, well, we're just continuing to evolve in an androgynous sense. And I think it's not until you accept that that is how we have been created by a creator.
If I can maybe finish your thought.
You go ahead, because I think I'm running out of steam.
If I'm right or wrong, you said the central importance for you is to recognize that you're a creature that is created. And it seems to me that part of the final part of that sentence is, and has a purpose.
Yes.
You have a telos.
Yes, exactly.
And that's what gives, ultimately, that's what gives you meaning.
Yes. And that's why we've chosen as the motto for Catholic Man UK and Ireland, Agere Sequitur Esse, action follows being. You do what you are created to do, or you are how you're created to be. And in that you find your fulfillment. And if, as for men, that's fatherhood. And really for me, that is the drive. As I said right at the beginning, I was looking for absolutes. And in that, I found my absolute. And I think then there is no turning away from it. You've got to keep following that road.
Well, I think that's a good point to draw a close to this conversation. I think maybe if we get a chance, if you're willing, we'd like to come back to talk about your role in the Shrine at Walsingham, amongst other things. But for tonight, I'd like to thank Sam Baker for joining us. I'd like to thank you out there in the internet, out in the World Wide Web, for joining us. Couple of things, Bill. We are having a webinar with Dr. Tara Sander-Lee of the Charlotte Lozier Institute. Charlotte Lozier Institute is a very, very well-known, very reputable Catholic Institute of Bioethics in the United States. I don't know if for anybody who followed our discussion with Father Vincent Toomey recently, he spoke highly of it. It's a very, very fine institute. And she will be doing a webinar with us on Thursday the 14th at 8 p.m. entitled The COVID Vaccine, Is It Safe and Is It Ethical? Dr. Tara is a scientist with 20 years experience in academic and clinical medicine with a PhD in biochemistry. And I'd recommend anybody who's curious, just you can get on the Google and look up Charlotte Lozier. It's, I think for a lot of people, there are a lot of questions they have about both the efficacy, the safety and the ethics of the vaccine. Well, Charlotte will be delighted to speak to those. Again, I'd like to invite you to hit the subscribe button. And again, if you can help us at all with any of the campaigns that we're working on at the moment, hit the old donate button. Whatever anybody can give will be most gratefully received and will be well used. But for tonight, I'd like to say good night. Stay well in these tough times. Stay at home and wash your hands. Goodbye and God bless.